At 3:42 inches the morning, on the 28th of July 1976, the city of Tangshan, China, ceased to exist. Not in the way cities are abandoned, not in the way they are rebuilt and renamed, but in the way a bone shatters under sudden, absolute pressure completely, instantaneously, and without warning. 1 million people were asleep. The coal miners of the night shift were deep underground, several hundred meters beneath the streets of a city that had been built on top of one of the most geologically active fault zones in northern China. Children lay in beds. Elderly couples slept on bamboo mats to stay cool in the summer heat. Factory workers who had pulled double shifts were finally deeply unconscious. The city breathed slowly in the darkness, and then the ground moved. In the 7 days before July 28th, residents in and around Tangshan had noticed things, strange things. Wells that had been reliable for decades were suddenly changing water levels, some dropping by more than a meter, some bubbling without explanation. Chickens in rural areas outside the city refused to enter their coops. Dogs howled through the night and could not be calmed. In the village of Qinglong County, less than 200 kilometers away, a local seismologist named Wang Chengqing had reviewed anomalous ground tilt data and issued an informal warning to local officials. Qinglong County evacuated. Tangshan did not. The Chinese government in 1976 was operating at the jagged, exhausted edge of the Cultural Revolution. The political machinery of Mao Zedong's China had spent the previous decade dismantling scientific institutions, sending geologists and engineers to labor camps for re-education, and replacing empirical expertise with revolutionary ideology. Earthquake prediction, under this system, was considered a matter for the masses, not for specialists. When the State Seismological Bureau received anomalous readings from instruments around the Tangshan region in the weeks before the disaster, the institutional infrastructure required to act on those readings had been partially destroyed by a decade of political purges. The formal warning never came. At 3:42 a.m. and 53 seconds, the first seismic wave reached the surface beneath central Tangshan at a depth of approximately 11 kilometers. The magnitude was 7.8. The epicenter sat almost directly beneath the city's densest residential district. The rupture traveled along the fault line at a velocity that covered the length of the urban core in roughly 8 seconds. 87 seconds. That is how long the primary shaking lasted, according to seismological records. 87 seconds for a city of 1 million people to be reduced to rubble. In those 87 seconds, approximately 93% of all residential buildings in Tangshan collapsed. The structures, mostly unreinforced brick and masonry construction, the standard working-class housing of industrial China in the 1970s, had no seismic resistance built into their design. They were not engineered to flex. They were not engineered to absorb lateral force. When the ground moved sideways at an acceleration that exceeded the gravitational force holding those buildings upright, the walls simply folded inward. Roofs dropped vertically. Floors pancaked on top of each other. The workers underground in the coal mines survived in higher numbers than anyone sleeping above them. The earth around them, despite shaking violently, held. The structures above them did not. The railway station collapsed. The hospital collapsed. The textile factory collapsed. The power plant was destroyed. The communication lines went silent. Water mains ruptured beneath the streets, turning intersections into sinkholes. Gas lines fractured and ignited small fires that burned without fire crews to suppress them because the fire stations had also collapsed. The roads out of the city were cracked and buckled, covered in debris, and in some places had simply dropped by more than a meter, where the ground beneath had liquefied during the shaking. Tangshan was not damaged. Tangshan was erased. By the time the shaking stopped, at 3:44 a.m., the city was dark, silent, and buried. The only sounds were the settling of rubble, the hiss of fractured gas lines, and beneath the wreckage, the sound of people still alive, pressing their hands against slabs of concrete they could not move, calling out for family members whose voices were not answering. The first seismograph readings were received at the State Seismological Bureau in Beijing at approximately 4:00 a.m. Initial reports were confused. Communication infrastructure from Tangshan itself had been completely severed. There were no telephone lines, no radio transmissions, no data. The first human reports to reach government officials came from survivors who had walked or driven out of the city on foot in the hours after the earthquake, covered in dust, some of them in shock, carrying nothing. The People's Liberation Army was mobilized quickly. By the morning of July 28th, military units were moving toward Tangshan, but the scale of the devastation was not yet understood. The roads were impassable in large sections. Bridges had collapsed. The railway lines were destroyed. Getting heavy rescue equipment into the city was not a matter of hours. It was a matter of days. And this is where the second catastrophe began. The government of the People's Republic of China in 1976 made a decision that would define the Tangshan disaster in the eyes of the world for decades to come. Within hours of the earthquake, offers of assistance began arriving from foreign governments and international organizations. Japan, which had its own hard history with catastrophic seismic events, offered rescue teams and equipment. The United States offered aid. The Red Cross attempted to coordinate an international response. Every offer was declined. The official position of the Chinese government was that the Chinese people were capable of overcoming this disaster through their own strength and revolutionary spirit. Accepting foreign assistance was framed as a form of weakness, an admission that the socialist state could not care for its own citizens. This position was not unique to Tangshan. It was consistent with Chinese foreign policy throughout the Mao era. But the consequences at Tangshan were measured in human lives, because the equipment that was not allowed into Tangshan was not symbolic. It was hydraulic rescue tools that could lift concrete slabs. It was trained search and rescue teams with listening devices capable of locating survivors beneath rubble. It was field hospitals with surgical capacity. It was supplies of blood, antibiotics, and intravenous fluid for people buried beneath collapsed buildings, who had survived the earthquake itself but were dying of crush injuries, of dehydration, of internal trauma that could have been treated if the treatment had been allowed to arrive. The Chinese military worked with extraordinary speed and sacrifice under conditions that were logistically nightmarish. Soldiers moved rubble by hand when equipment was unavailable. Medical personnel treated injuries in open fields without adequate supplies. But the fundamental arithmetic of this disaster was brutal. There were hundreds of thousands of people trapped beneath debris across a destroyed city, and the equipment and expertise that could have extracted many of them in time was being turned away at the border. They thought the worst was over, but the true nightmare was just beginning. On August 1st, 4 days after the initial earthquake, a major aftershock struck Tangshan. The magnitude was 7.1. It was not a minor tremor. It was, by any standard measure, a significant earthquake in its own right. Buildings and structures that had been partially damaged by the first event but had remained standing structures that survivors had taken shelter in, structures that rescue workers were using as staging areas, collapsed. People who had survived the first 87 seconds died on August, first beneath walls they had believed were still standing. The total number of aftershocks recorded in the weeks following the main event exceeded 3,000, and still, no foreign assistance was permitted to enter. The official death toll, released by the Chinese government after a delay of several years, the figures were not made public until 1979, was 242,419 people. This made the 1,976 Tangshan earthquake the deadliest earthquake of the 20th century by official count, and the third deadliest in recorded human history, behind the 1,556 Shaanxi earthquake and the 1,976 estimate itself. Some researchers who have studied mortality patterns in the affected region believe the actual figure may have been higher, possibly exceeding 300,000, accounting for deaths in surrounding counties and townships that were not included in the initial city-centered count. An additional 164,000 people were severely injured. The injured number matters because it represents people who survived the earthquake but whose lives were permanently altered by it, limbs lost, spinal injuries sustained, chronic conditions caused by weeks of inadequate medical care in the immediate aftermath. The population of Tangshan before the earthquake was approximately 1 million people. The earthquake killed roughly 1 in 4 of them. In the hours immediately after the disaster, a survivor named Li Yukun, a coal worker who had been on his way to the night shift when the ground moved, later recalled to state journalists, and his account was recorded in the documentary record published in the 1980s, that when the shaking stopped, he stood in the street and could not find the street. Every reference point had disappeared. The building he had lived in for 12 years was a pile of bricks approximately 2 meters high. The intersection he crossed every day was unrecognizable. He described the air as tasting of brick dust and something else he could not name, a mineral, chalky smell that would not leave the back of his throat for days. A dispatch logged by one of the first PLA communications officers to reach the outskirts of Tangshan in the early morning of July 28th described the scene as follows. The city appeared from the approach road as though it had been pressed flat from above. The skyline, which should have been visible from several kilometers out, was simply absent. He reported that the officer commanding the first unit to enter the city told his radio operator to transmit a single sentence back to headquarters before any further communication. The city is gone. A factory supervisor from the Tangshan Iron and Steel Company, whose account was collected by Chinese journalists in the 1980s, described waking beneath a collapsed concrete ceiling that had somehow landed at an angle and created a small pocket of space around her. She described pressing her hand against the concrete, feeling it was warm from the summer night, and spending 4 hours listening to voices on the other side of the rubble growing quieter and then stopping. She was extracted by soldiers on the morning of July 28th. She later said that the silence that fell over the rubble in those 4 hours was more frightening than the sound of the earthquake itself. That silence, that was the sound of Tangshan in the days that followed. The rescue operation continued for weeks, but the grim mathematics of crush injury survival mean that the window for recovering people alive from collapsed buildings narrows sharply after 72 hours. The lack of specialized equipment in the first 3 days was not an abstract policy failure. It was a countdown. Every hour that passed without hydraulic lifting equipment, without acoustic detection devices, without surgical field hospitals, reduced the number of people who could be pulled from the rubble alive. The PLA soldiers who worked the recovery operation experienced profound psychological trauma, according to accounts that emerged in Chinese memoirs and journalistic retrospectives published decades later. Many described being unable to sleep for the sounds they heard beneath the rubble in the first day's tapping, voices, sounds that gradually went silent over 72 hours as they worked to reach them. Some units continued working without rotation for 36 to 48 hours at a stretch in the July heat, digging through rubble with their hands when tools were unavailable. The psychological cost of that experience on the men and women who lived through it was substantial and largely unacknowledged for many years afterward. Tangshan itself sat in a state of absolute material devastation for months. The city had been the industrial heart of northern China's coal and steel sector. The Kailuan coal mine, one of the largest in China, had its surface infrastructure destroyed. The steelworks were damaged. The railway hub that connected Beijing to northeastern China ran through Tangshan and was completely disrupted, causing logistical cascades that affected industrial supply chains across northern China for months. Rebuilding began almost immediately, but the scale of the task was staggering. A city of 1 million people had to be housed in temporary shelters through the remainder of the summer and through the following winter. Food, water, and medical supplies had to be transported in over damaged infrastructure. The entire urban core had to be demolished and rebuilt from nothing. The new Tangshan that emerged over the following decade was built to seismic codes, a direct lesson encoded in concrete and rebar from the 87 seconds of the 28th of July 1976. The political context of the earthquake is impossible to separate from its human cost. 1,976 was the final year of Mao Zedong's life. He died on the 9th of September 1976, 43 days after the Tangshan earthquake. In traditional Chinese cosmology, catastrophic natural events, floods, earthquakes, eclipses had for centuries been interpreted as signals of dynastic change, as signs that the mandate of heaven was shifting. The earthquake at Tangshan, along with the death of Premier Zhou Enlai in January 1976 and the death of military leader Zhu De in July, was noted by many people inside China as part of a sequence of terrible omens in a single year. The government officially rejected such interpretations as superstition, but the fear was present, running beneath the official language of revolutionary solidarity and collective strength. The Gang of Four, the political faction that had controlled much of China's ideological machinery through the late Cultural Revolution, was arrested in October 1976, 6 weeks after Mao's death. The era that had suppressed seismic science, that had sent geologists to labor camps, that had prioritized ideological purity over technical expertise, ended within months of the earthquake. Whether that transition would have happened without Tangshan, without the visible, undeniable, catastrophic consequence of a decade of anti-intellectual governance, is a question historians have continued to ask. In the 1980s, as China began its reform era, the Tangshan earthquake was gradually reintegrated into public discourse. A museum was established, survivor testimonies were collected, the 1986 film Chinsu, and later the 2010 film Aftershock, directed by Feng Xiaogang, brought the human dimensions of the disaster to new generations of Chinese audiences. The 2010 film was watched by over 100 million people in China within its first weeks of release. It depicted not only the immediate devastation, but the psychological trauma carried by survivors across decades, the guilt of those who lived, the grief of those who lost entire families, the particular anguish of a disaster that happened in the dark, without warning, to people who had no chance to run. Because that is the nature of the Tangshan earthquake that no statistic fully captures. It happened at 3:42 inches the morning. The victims were not caught in the open, not fleeing, not making decisions. They were asleep. The most vulnerable human state. They had no agency in those 87 seconds. They were simply there, in buildings that were not designed to protect them, in a city that had not been warned, in a country where the apparatus of warning had been partially dismantled by ideology, and the ground moved. The children who lost parents in the rubble of Tangshan were designated a specific term in the disaster's aftermath, orphans of the earthquake. Many were sent to state facilities. Some were adopted by military families. Their experiences, reconstructed across decades of oral history and journalistic investigation, describe a childhood marked by a specific kind of silence, the absence of people who had been present one moment and were simply gone the next, without explanation that a child could absorb, without a body to mourn in many cases, because the body was part of the rubble of a building that had been demolished and carted away. The seismological lessons of Tangshan were absorbed, at least partially, into international building codes and earthquake preparedness planning in the years that followed. China's own seismic building codes were substantially revised after 1976. The construction of unreinforced masonry residential buildings in high seismic risk zones was phased out in favor of reinforced concrete frames designed to absorb lateral loading. The principle of soft story collapse, the tendency of the lowest flexible story in a building to collapse under lateral seismic load, was studied extensively using the Tangshan failure patterns as a reference dataset. But the political lesson, the lesson about the cost of refusing outside help, about the consequence of ideological isolation in a moment of mass human catastrophe, that lesson has been absorbed more unevenly. The instinct toward self-sufficiency, toward controlling the narrative of national disaster, toward declining assistance that carries any implication of foreign superiority or domestic inadequacy, did not end with the Tangshan earthquake or with the death of Mao Zedong. It has appeared again in subsequent Chinese disasters. It has appeared in disasters across many nations and many political systems. The specific mechanisms change. The underlying pattern does not. 242,419 people. That is the number the Chinese government placed on record in 1979, 3 years after the earthquake, After a period in which the disaster had been largely undiscussed in the state media and the full scale of the death toll had not been publicly confirmed. The delay itself was telling. A government that was confident in its response to a disaster does not take 3 years to announce how many people died. The delay was a form of accounting, not of the dead, but of the political exposure of the living. Today, Tangshan is a modern city. The population has grown back beyond its pre-earthquake levels. The streets are wide, the buildings are reinforced, and the coal mine that sits beneath part of the urban geology continues to operate. There is a memorial park at the site of the heaviest residential destruction. The park is quiet. In the summer, children play near the memorial markers. The ground beneath them has not moved significantly since August 1976, but the fault is still there. It has always been there. It was there when the first miners came to Tangshan in the 19th century to dig coal. It was there when the city grew into an industrial hub of millions. It was there on the night of the 27th of July 1976, when 1 million people went to sleep without knowing that the next morning they would wake into a world that no longer had the shape they recognized. Geologists who study the region note that the fault system beneath northern China remains seismically active. The 1,976 earthquake released enormous stress that had accumulated over centuries, but it did not eliminate the underlying tectonic forces that generated it. The question of when the next significant earthquake will strike the region is not a question of whether. It is a question of when, and of whether, when that moment comes, the institutions designed to warn people will be functioning, the buildings designed to protect them will be standing, and the decisions made in the hours after will be made for the people buried in the rubble rather than for the people watching from a distance. 87 seconds. That is how long it took to kill 242,000 people. The clock is always running.